Forgive me for not having all the details. This was in the summer quite a few years back in 1994, so as much as I can remember, there will be things that I cannot. So I was 23 and hiking up in Idaho somewhere near Yellow Pine, I believe. I was not from the area, not even from the state, so I was quite interested in exploring nature. I came from quite a big city but was visiting some friends up in Idaho and I thought I'd take a hike and explore. Quite interesting it was, and around midday I was high up in the mountains when I noticed someone quite a distance behind me, seemingly following me. They were too far away to make out any details, but at the time I had no worries about them, though I did just want to be alone. As I made my way up higher and higher in the mountains, the person behind me seemed to be following me. Occasionally I'd check back, sort of like an instinct, as if the person was staring at me. It was a feeling that told me to look behind me. I also noticed when I stopped, the person would stop. It was a game of cat and mouse almost. However, when I stopped, I got a little more detail of whoever this was. They appeared to be male and about the same height I was. I hiked further and further and the sun began to set as this man was still following me. Maybe it was a homeless dude who had a mental problem was my first thought. Then I thought maybe it was just a local person trying to tell me to come down. But then whenever I stopped, why did they? Things weren't adding up and I began to focus more on this weirdo following me and less on where I was going. It dawned upon me that I was really high in the mountains and it was becoming night. I had to get down some way, but how? I didn't remember telling anybody I had gone into the mountains. In fact, I had not been to my friend's house yet. I was still supposed to be another day, but I had gone hiking instead of visiting him. The sun was just on the horizon and I decided I had to get back down, but someone was following me. "How's it going there?" I shouted to him. There was no response. It was getting dark super fast and I was stuck on a mountain with someone whose intentions I had no idea. Could they rob me or murder me? Fear was taking over me, and as the sun was now gone from the horizon, I started panicking. I decided I'd turn around and get the hell out of there, and the person following me would leave too maybe, or maybe I'd defend myself somehow. Instantly I spun around and they were gone. I figured my mind was messing with me. I was having some tricks played on me. Maybe the person behind me was some sort of odd illusion. Maybe they'd left. Maybe they were hiding in the bushes waiting for me to come down so they could pop out and attack me. So avoiding something like that, I decided to take a different route. This would involve me going up a little bit more and taking a turn and heading down, and hopefully that would get me to where I wanted to go. As I advanced up the hill, the moon was providing some nice light, but I couldn't see too well. This wasn't a jungle where the moonlight couldn't penetrate the leaves. I could somewhat see where I wanted to go. With lack of city lights, there'd be billions of stars to see. I kept going up a bit more and I noticed it was particularly quiet out. Then I noticed a strange noise. Faint crackling like an old-time radio. Was there a campfire? Was it a forest fire up ahead? I started listening and realized there were some faint voices, at least one faint voice talking. Maybe there were some people that could help me out. I slowly made my way towards the sounds and then it stopped. I thought maybe they heard me, but the crackling that accompanied the voices was also gone. I hadn't heard water getting poured on the fire, no sizzle or anything. I also noticed the moment they stopped talking, so had the crackling. Slowly, I started walking in a different direction, still trying to keep where I was going to make the loop around. Then I heard something else, an odd whistle. The whistle wasn't something cheerful like someone merrily walking down the street and whistling to themselves would do, or someone would whistle to a dog. This was a long, high whistle that was strange because it didn't sound like whoever was whistling was pausing for a second to take an inhale of air. There also wasn't any wind blowing at all and the trees weren't moving, so I was perplexed to know what it was, but also quite scared. The long continuous whistle began to get lower as I walked, and the whistle didn't sound like it came from a particular area. It came from everywhere. Suddenly, the whistle stopped too. Right as the eerie whistling stopped, came moaning. Deep, horrifying moaning. Someone was in pain. Someone was hurt and needed help. Perhaps someone had fallen out of a tree maybe and got hurt. Fortunately, I could pinpoint where the moaning was coming from and I began to pick up my pace. The moaning was coming from up ahead. As I began to make a small curve in the pathway I was on, I looked up ahead and noticed something horrific. The man who was behind me was now in the distance in front of me on the curve walking away from me. He was moaning and dragging his feet, slightly hunched over as he walked. In fear of seeing me, I crouched low and he continued on shuffling down the pathway. In my head, I realized that perhaps this guy was hurt, like if a bear slashed his face or something. I stood back up and slowly walked towards him. "Hello, are you hurt?" I called. The man shuffled along, but I drew closer. I thought I was being foolish and childish for being afraid, but then again there was that creepy whistle and the old radio-like voices I had heard earlier, which I was a bit shaken up about. "Do you need my help?" I asked again, and the man didn't turn around at all or say anything. He kept moaning away. "Do you need medical attention at all?" I asked. I was so close and I was ready to bolt. I noticed the shaking in my voice. The moaning stopped and the guy turned around. The man had black eyes, no whites in his eyes. It seemed somewhat alien-like, but they were normal-sized, not big and oval. I only got a brief look at his entire face. He had no mouth and no nose, sort of like Voldemort but without the slits. They weren't torn off or bandaged. They looked like they hadn't grown at all. I just took off running, but I only made it maybe 20 feet. Crashing through some bushes, I fell. Not straight down, just at an angle of sorts. It was a somewhat steep sort of hill, but you definitely couldn't walk up or down it. I fell and finally rolled to the bottom of the slope. I was in pain. I hadn't broken my legs, thank God, but they were cut up really bad. I couldn't move them well and likely sprained my ankle. I was having lots of difficulty even standing up, so I laid on my back a moment and heard a high-pitched cackle coming from the top of the hill. I looked up and saw the black-eyed man begin making his way down the slope towards me, as a terrifying combination of screaming and laughter rang out from his voice. But he had no mouth, so how could he make such clear vocal noises without it being muffled? The way he was making his way down was creepy too. His legs seemed to be bent at odd angles as he descended. He wasn't using his hands or legs. He was carefully taking impossible steps down towards me. That was the adrenaline rush I needed to get back on my feet. I started limp running from the spot. As I quickly looked back, I saw the man crawling down the slope, and I turned around and hurried faster through some bushes and trees as a loud screeching was echoing behind me in the distance. I made it to my car. My legs started hurting again as I calmed down a bit and drove to my friend's house. The rest of the night is a bit shady. I think I blacked out and woke up numerous times. One of my friends had a first aid kit and managed to patch me up on my legs and a few cuts I had on my arms and back. None were deep enough to require stitches. I was quite lucky. The next morning I had a general idea on how I fell. I didn't remember all the details, but I told my friends that I got scared by a creepy guy with black eyes and fell. Eventually, more details came back to me for the 2 weeks I was there. I hardly went out of the house. I didn't tell a lot of people about this story. I don't think it would be a good icebreaker. All I can say is, I hope to never see that again. A few years ago, I went on a camping trip with some of my friends. We decided to go for a 1.5-week long hike on a trail in the mountains, and we had enough cars so we could park my friend's Jeep SUV at the end and take my truck to the beginning of the trail so we wouldn't have to walk back to where we started. The trail went roughly in a U-shape, so the beginning and the end weren't too far apart. It was during early summer, so we assumed the trails would be populated and safe. However, it wasn't long before weird stuff started happening. The first day went okay. We passed a group going the opposite way and they seemed like they had a blast. We talked for a bit and moved on, and shortly afterwards we took a lunch break. After eating, I went off the path about 40 feet to take a leak, and when I was done I walked over to a tall boulder with the intention of looking at the trail ahead of us. On my way over there, I ended up running into a dead moose. At first I was startled, but then I took a closer look. It looked like it had been freshly killed and the whole underbelly was torn open. However, there weren't any organs inside. I just assumed it had been killed and gutted by a hunter, and he was going to come back and get it after disposing of the organs. So I left it there and went back to my friends. The rest of the day went by relatively uneventful, and we stopped in a clearing to set up our tents and got a fire started. We spent the rest of the night just goofing around and told scary stories until it was time to sleep. Most of the stories were pretty lame, but there were a few that spooked me a little, and the same for the rest. I knew it was all just nonsense, so I slept fine. When we awoke the next morning, it looked like some of our gear had been moved. Backpacks moved around, boots scattered around the tents, that kind of stuff. It was pretty weird, but we didn't think much of it and continued on. I guess we just assumed it was animals, or we had actually left it that way and forgot or something. During the day, we came across several more dead animals, like deer and foxes and stuff. They were all mutilated like they had been ripped apart during death. We assumed it was just predators and didn't think much of it, even though we had never seen this many before. Shortly before we stopped again for camp, we came across a dead brown bear off the side of the trail. It had been mutilated like the others and had all the meat on its legs stripped off the bones, and it looked like it was walking on stilts. This really freaked us out because there's not any animals that I'm aware of that would mess with a grizzly, let alone be able to kill it like that. On a previous hiking trip, we had a close encounter with one and luckily weren't attacked. From then on, we always carried guns with us hiking. I always had my Ruger Blackhawk 44 mag in a shoulder holster. As we were setting up camp about a quarter mile from the dead bear, a group of rangers on horseback rode by carrying rifles. They stopped and talked to us for a bit and suddenly got really curious when I mentioned the bear we came across and all the other dead animals. They asked if I could show them to it, which I did, and they were very interested in it. I left them there and went back to the camp, and we did our usual ghost stories and stuff before drifting off to sleep. When we awoke, there was more weird stuff like the previous morning, and the same happened the next morning, along with seeing more animal carcasses. On the morning of the 5th day of the hike, the campsite was a mess, our stuff scattered everywhere, and someone in the other tent noticed muddy handprints on the rain flap. At this point, we decided someone was stalking us and purposely messing with our campsite in an effort to freak us out. We decided to keep calm and not let this person win, and we knew that if anything turned violent, we were all armed and we would be able to defend ourselves. We pressed onward, content not to let this ruin our trip. The next night, we decided to have people keep watch in 3-hour shifts. Nothing happens during my watch, and I wake the next guy up for his. He brings his camera with him because he said the flash would illuminate the area if someone was out there. It doesn't matter though because he ended up falling asleep just before dawn. While eating breakfast, someone asked him why he was taking pictures last night. Confused, he checks the memory card of his camera, only to find pictures of everybody sleeping, including himself. My friend is terrified right now because we are still 40 miles from our cars and would still have to sleep a few more nights, so he decides to keep quiet about the pictures. The next few days got considerably weirder. Our tents would get moved around during the night while we were asleep and be in different areas of the site, and no one would wake up while it was happening. Whoever was on watch would fall asleep and would be found still sleeping when the sun came up. On one of the last days, we all woke up outside of our tents around the campfire. At this point, we were all scared and we were trying to get back as fast as possible. It was at this point that my friend decided to tell everybody about the pictures, and to our horror, we see our sleeping bodies, some taken very close to our faces. The last one was of the friend who the camera belonged to's sleeping face, only this time it had a bone-white hand cupping his chin. We estimated that we had 2 more days of hiking left, so we hurried up and tried to get out as fast as possible. We found a good spot to camp, hopefully for the last time. The next morning, we awoke on the ground in a meadow away from our campsite. We lost a lot of time looking for our campsite, and when we got back, we found that most of our gear was shredded, including our tents. Someone miraculously managed to find the car keys, and we took our food that we had left hanging in a tree and continued as fast as we could. Going as fast as we could, we got to the Jeep after it had gotten dark, and since we were all so tired, all 6 of us piled in the car, locked the doors, and fell asleep within minutes. The next morning, we were awakened by someone knocking on the window. It was a cop, and he was asking what we were doing in an enclosed area. As we were explaining ourselves, he said that the whole area had been closed due to abnormal animal activity. All sorts of animal carcasses had been found mutilated, and they closed the area down due to safety concerns. When asked why the police were handling this instead of the park rangers, the officer paused and looked away. The awkward silence was interrupted by my friend pointing out that there were about a dozen cars in the parking lot, all with flat tires. We piled out of the van and saw that our own tires had been slashed. At this point, the cop comes clean and says that there's actually a manhunt in the area, but they're not sure what exactly they're dealing with. A lot of hikers had been going missing, and several had turned up dead the last week. My friend then remembers the pictures on his camera and hands it to the cop. The cop's face suddenly goes blank and he hands back the camera. It's a photo that was taken inside the car the night before. Partially visible in the last photo, which is of my friend's sleeping face, like some kind of party photo where the taker holds the camera at arm's length to get himself in, is the right half of a pure white face with black holes for eyes and a mouth full of sharpened animal-like teeth.